everyone. While they bring that up, I'm just going to say hello. My name is Elspeth Hay, and I'm a journalist and an author, not primarily a nut grower, although I do have some experiments happening at my house. And I'm excited to talk to you all today. I am obsessed with the fact that acorns are edible. And I'm willing to bet that even though you're here at this conference, some of you out there are wondering why acorns. They're not the easiest nuts, right? And I want to tell you today why I am so excited about them. I know that, next slide, please. All of us here have at some moment felt panicky or depressed about our current industrial food system and what it's doing to the living world. That up there is an algae bloom caused by fertilizer runoff in Lake Erie in 2014. So toxic that the city of Toledo had to shut down its tap water system. And it doesn't have to be this way. I've been reporting on food and the environment for the past 15 years. And the conversations that I've had over the past 5 years about nuts and acorns in particular have been by far the most life changing and hopeful I've ever heard. So I'm not going to try to tell you today about the specifics of nut growing and breeding because you all are the experts on that. But I do want to talk a little bit about the big picture of what I've learned talking to people about how and why we should grow these nuts. So that's the story that I want to share with you today. First, I'm going to tell you how I came to be so excited about acorns and other tree nuts. Then I'll talk about why these trees are so powerful. And finally, I'll explain why I think these trees need us and our help as humans today more than ever. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to dive into how I became an acorn lover. I grew up with two bird watcher parents, and I spent my childhood being carted around the state of Maine, looking at birds and learning about their habitats. That's me with my first pair of binoculars as a very small person. In the picture with the braids, I'm working with Leach's storm petrels off the coast of Canada. And as my parents took me around showing me these birds and teaching me about them, I learned that they were all perfectly adapted to their habitats. I learned about crossbills, which have mandibles perfectly adapted to extracting seeds from the conifers in the forest where they lived, and about sapsuckers, which drill these neat little rows of holes into maples and birches to feed themselves. And then my family would go to the grocery store and we would get our food from industrial farms, the same farms that I knew were destroying the habitat of these wild bird species. And to me, it seemed like we were the one species without a place to live in the natural world, the one species that kind of didn't fit. And I don't think I could have articulated it as a kid, but I found this really devastating. Based on everything I heard, it seemed like the living world around us would be better off without humans. Next slide, please. And that was a pretty sad story to grow up with. So uh, we can, I think, go to the next slide again. So then I grew up and moved to Cape Cod in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, which is in the heart of the Cape Cod National Seashore, which is almost entirely protected land, protected from humans, mostly oak and pitch pine forest. And I got a job reporting on food and the environment for my local NPR station. And I've been doing that for about 10 years when a friend sent me a TEDx talk by a woman in Greece named Marcy Mayer. And Mayer calls herself an acorn ambassador. She said in her talk that humans can eat acorns. And not only that, but that they're a superfood and one of our oldest human foods. And I was totally shocked. I looked out my window at all these oak trees that I had always seen as an impediment to food production and started wondering, wait, what? You can eat these things that have been falling on my roof all this time? So I reached out to Mayor. I started talking to her about how she processes acorns and turns them into flour. That's her in the top left there, working with a bunch of others to process acorns on Kia Island in Greece, where she lives. Um, and I got really excited about the idea that the acorns might be a food source and could maybe make humans part of the places where we live in the same way that the birds have been part of the ecosystems that I'd visited growing up. And this might have been sort of a passing excitement, except for a few other things that started happening at the same time. Next slide, please. So, this brings me to the second thing I want to share with you, which is why these trees are so powerful. Around the same time that I learned that we can eat acorns, my mom got really excited about an entomologist named Doug Tallamy. Has anyone here ever heard of Tallamy? All right. So he's from Pennsylvania. His big message is that oak trees and some other keystone native plants, including other nut trees, have an outsized importance ecologically. A keystone species is one that's as important to its ecosystem as the keystone in a Roman arch. So you take it out and the whole system falls apart. My mom obviously got excited about the bird side of things. Ptolemy has studied the relationship between plant species and insects, which form the base of a lot of our food chains. And he found that 75% of the insect food required by birds and other wild animals is produced by just a few plant families. There's a list up there that you can sort of see some of the fine print, but there's a lot of nut trees on that list. And I was really surprised when my mom told me that chickadee parents, for example, need more than 6,000 caterpillars to raise a brood of just 5 babies. That's a lot of caterpillars, way more than I would have expected. And Ptolemy has found that some plants are home to more caterpillars and insects than others. So, for instance, maples support 297 species of caterpillars, while yellowwoods, which grow in the southeastern US, support none. So, not all plants are created equal when it comes to food production and supporting wildlife and ecosystem health. Some plants do very little, and others are heavy lifters. And oaks are actually the top life support species in most North American ecosystems. They support, as a genus, more than 557 species of caterpillars, which is way more than other groups of trees. And many cultures have historically called oaks the tree of life. So clearly they were onto something, and this is for good reason. And hazelnuts, hickories, walnuts, beech trees, and chestnuts also support a fair amount of caterpillars, all in the top 20 out of woody plant groups for ecosystem support. So when my mom got excited about this, next slide, please, and started telling me about how important oak trees and other nut trees are to birds and other wildlife, I started putting the pieces together. Like I would imagine many of you, I realized growing our food on these keystone nut trees would basically do the opposite to the living world around us of what our current industrial farming is doing. And I was telling a friend about this, and they said, "Oh, you have to go to this talk coming up at the high school by a guy named Mark Shepard. He's this Midwestern farmer doing this thing called restoration agriculture based on creating farms around these keystone nut trees." So I went and I got totally sucked into the nut world. And I ended up visiting not only Shepard's farm, but also talking with so many other nut growers, many of whom are here, and also visiting places as far afield as Switzerland and England and France. And as this happened, I got really into the etymology of the words around nut growing that told the story of how all over the Northern Hemisphere for thousands of years, people have been eating these nuts as staple foods. A lot of our words for oak in different languages actually mean food or food tree. The name of the tree family Fagaceae, which includes oaks and beeches and chestnuts, comes from the Greek meaning to eat. Our English word mast comes from the Gothic mats, meaning food. And I started reading about acorn eating cultures in China, Korea, Japan, the Mediterranean, Europe, North America, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. And again, who knows? Maybe this still would have been kind of a passing obsession, but then something else happened, which brings me to my last point, which is why these trees need us so much right now. So after I learned, next slide, please, that we can eat acorns and what ecological powerhouses oaks are, and started going down this tree nut rabbit hole. Next slide, please. Which I'm sure many of you can relate to. An acorn friend introduced me to a man named Ron Reed. Ron is an indigenous medicine man, biologist, and member of the Karuk tribe in present day California. And his people have eaten acorns and tended oaks as a staple food crop since time immemorial. And during the early pandemic, he and I spent a lot of time on Zoom together talking about acorns. And during our conversations, in between these conversations, I started collecting and processing acorns and making my own flour. And as I did, I noticed that some oak trees were healthier than others. And I asked Ron why he thought that was. And he told me a story. He said that in Kuruk culture, every year, his people perform what are called Pikyawish or world renewal ceremonies. And the point is to create habitat for other species through ceremony. And that surprised me. So I asked, how? How do you create habitat for oaks and hazelnuts and deer through ceremony? I'd always seen oaks as natural and wild, two words that pretty much by definition exclude human tending and care. And he said, fire. Every year during world renewal ceremonies, Kuruk people light prescribed or cultural fires to keep the land healthy. I didn't really know what to do with this answer. So I went down another rabbit hole, the fire rabbit hole. And I learned that many oak ecosystems do, in fact, need fire to stay healthy, not just in California, but also in a lot of other places across North America. And that, in fact, because of fire suppression, oaks, which are these incredibly important life support species, are in many ecosystems, not just in North America, but also in other places, actually having trouble regenerating. So I went and I got trained in prescribed fire and started going on burns in Oaklands, where I live in Massachusetts. And as I did, I kept talking to Ron, and he kept reminding me that this is our job to burn the trees to keep them healthy. And even as I absorbed this, it kept surprising me because I had always seen humans as a threat to the natural world. And here Ron was telling me that we are vital to these keystone trees that in their own right are vital to so many other species. And slowly, what I came to understand as I sort of translated what Ron was telling me into my own background of Western science speak, was that not only are oaks a keystone species, but also so are we. There are different kinds of keystone species, mutualists like bees, keystone plants like oaks, predators like sharks, and then there's this category called ecosystem engineers. So that's beavers, right? They create wetlands and dam. That's elephants. They trample and uproot. And ecosystem engineers perform a function that's really vital to their habitat uh, and change the places where they live. And today, we modify ecosystems often in negative ways. We emit greenhouse gases, there's fertilizer runoff, ecosystem destruction. But historically, our largest role has been to create and manage ecosystems with fire. As fire historian Stephen Pine has put it, we are the fire animal. This is true in places as wide ranging as the Amazon and Australia, and also here in North America. In so many places across this continent, we humans and our fire and keystone nut trees have been in relationship for thousands of years. So before I close, I want to put in a word for remembering these ecosystem relationships as we move forward in working with nut trees. I know how easy it can be to get lost in the details of what we're doing and to think that incorporating something as unpredictable as fire is just too much. But in so many different places from so many different people, I have now heard the same thing, that humans, nut trees, and fire have been in relationship for millennia. And that in getting back into relationship, we have the opportunity to restore our land through food production and to completely flip the script on stories about humans and the living world that I learned as a kid. So, if this excites you, and I hope it does, I wrote you a whole book full of stories. I'll have it here for sale after the talk. I'll be out there. And I am so grateful to have been included. Thank you.